Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore, and this is the third episode in our criminal justice reform series. In episode 1, we visited with Damian Shade and Ryan Gensler from the Oklahoma Policy Institute to discuss data points of the criminal justice system here in Oklahoma, where we're at, how many people are behind bars, the crimes and other factors that led to them being there, and the disparate impact on different communities in our state. In episode 2, we spoke with criminal defense attorney Brian Jones to dig a little deeper and to get a personal feel for what it's like for someone to interact with the criminal justice system for the first time. Using the example of a simple drug possession charge, Brian walked us through the fines, fees, and faults of our current criminal justice system. For episode 3, we are turning our attention more fully to the potential fixes for this broken system. We're joined by Oklahoma State House Representative Garry Mize to discuss recent ballot measures such as State Questions 780, 781, and 788, as well as some other bills that are being discussed by the state legislature. Now, this will be the final episode in this mini-series. Next week, we will begin our next podcast series on the topic of gerrymandering and redistricting. It's legit fascinating and admittedly somewhat frustrating. We have some great guests from both Oklahoma and other states to help explain how our democracy got so messed up and what we can do to fix it. But more on that later. For now, let's hear our conversation about criminal justice reform with Representative Garry Mize. All right. Hey, welcome back to Let's Pod This. This episode is as part of our criminal justice reform series, and we are joined by State Representative Garry Mize from Guthrie. Hello, sir.
Hello, how are you?
Well, so in this episode, we want to give listeners somewhat of a recap, reminder about State Questions 780 and 781, how they came to be and what they did. So Representative Mize, you were newly elected in the legislature. You've been there, as of this recording, just a little over a year. You were elected in November of 2018. Tell us a little bit about your involvement with that issue, and if you can, a recap of those two measures.
So I was elected in November. Obviously, my primary in June of last year, and then the general in November. So we just finished up our first session. So those were measures that I was talking about when I was out campaigning, but I also voted on. 780 was moving felony possession to a misdemeanor for drug possession, and 781.
So the 780 ideally results in savings to the state, and that savings is supposed to be rolled over into treatment programs for substance abuse. Is that right, Scott?
Yes.
Scott is squinting as he remembers.
Yes, I believe that is the
Only
case.
like 7 months ago. So those were the two measures. But I think 781 is the one that gets most of the press because as of yet we haven't seen any money go towards treatment programs from 81.
Right. Well, and we had an issue, or we're currently seeing this play out in the courts right now with the opioid settlements.
Right.
And earlier in the year, there was a settlement with Purdue.
Yeah.
Is it Purdue?
Mm-hmm.
And there were some questions and concerns about how that was handled, where that money went, and who was directing it.
Right.
I think when you look at 780 and 781 and then 788 together, that's a really interesting landscape for the criminal justice system in Oklahoma right now. So 780, and these were, and you said 7 months ago. These were in 2016, bro.
Oh, well, I meant 2 years and 7 months.
That's right.
Clearly.
Right. So 780, exactly like you said, Representative, 780 took simple drug possession and some minor property crimes and reclassified them from felonies to misdemeanors. And then 781 told OMES, Office of Management and Enterprise Services, and says that office is supposed to look at those changes from felony to misdemeanor, calculate how much money that's going to save the state of Oklahoma, and then direct those amounts into a fund that's used by county governments, right, to provide substance abuse and mental health services, right? So that's kind of one set. But then you also have 788, right, which legalizes medical marijuana and kind of changes the landscape of what just having marijuana on your person looks like. And now you've got people who are incarcerated for something that either was a felony, is now a misdemeanor, or is now no longer a crime like at all, right?
Well, yeah, and you have this the nuance of 788 and the way in which it was proposed and communicated as medical marijuana, but the way that it was written.
Oh yeah,
and really the end product is more of a recreational marijuana bill or law. So you have that nuance to the whole situation.
So that's the backdrop under which you came to office to try and sort all this out. So what is that like?
There was a committee that dealt with that, and we would hear about what was going on. Obviously, you could be a part of that as much as you wanted to, but if you weren't on that committee, you had plenty of other things to do. So
this is the joint working group,
the joint committee. We didn't hear that very often. A few of us giggle, but I think that they did the best that they could do, and are still going to work on that issue. I think it's naive to say that just because it was a vote of the people that you're not going to have issue with that.
Well, the particularly 788 didn't articulate every detail of what needs to be articulated for how this law is implemented, and the rules surrounding that. And so there's been this extensive rulemaking process.
The work that they did, if I understand, a fair amount of it was around packaging, labeling, seed to sale tracking, so that what we have in this state isn't taken over by marijuana from another state, or people coming in trying to manipulate what we have here.
Right. For example, the law says it's got to be tested, but there was no, or the measure said it had to be tested, but there was no stipulation about testing for what, who tests, how often, at what stage, who's the authority to oversee that.
What's too high, what's too low.
Yeah, right. What is that's the physician. It's like, what is a dose exactly?
Yeah, right.
So you just had this open framework
with
788, and they've really tried to put some guts to it.
Right. But I feel like it's interesting because a lot of, we're talking about criminal justice reform, right? And a lot of the work that, all of the state questions have dealt with substance use in some measure, right? And most of the work that's happened in the legislature on criminal justice reform has revolved around the issue of substance use, right? Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, some. We had the two that we were talking about before we went live, which I'm sure we'll get to again. But two of the bills that I carried, one of them, was specifically dealt with substance abuse, possession with intent to distribute. But the other one was sentence enhancement. So there's a few different nuances, obviously, to criminal justice reform, and several ways that you can go about it, tackle it, make change, affect change.
So tell us a little bit about those two measures.
So I had two bills that I carried this last session. It was House Bill 2009, and then I believe it was House Bill 1100. I think I'm right on that. But 2009 dealt with sentence enhancements. So we were going to decrease the sentencing on repeat offenders from 2 times max sentence of the original offense to 1 1/4. And then possession with intent to distribute on House Bill 1100, what we were seeking to do there was just getting a more clear definition in statute of what possession with intent to distribute looked like.
Because there wasn't a definition in statute.
Correct.
Or it wasn't clear.
Correct.
Right. There's not a law that says if you have, and let's use, I have no idea how much drugs is a lot of drugs.
It was more subjective than objective.
But so I'm making up numbers here, but you might have last week when we were talking, or on our other episode when we were talking with Brian, we used the example of Andy getting arrested for marijuana. So, which he hasn't, but if he did, let's say that he got arrested and he had, is a gram of marijuana? Is that a lot? It's a little. I have no idea.
That's one joint, I think.
Okay.
According to the billboards I see selling it these days.
So let's say that Andy got arrested and he had 5 grams of weed on him, right? one person could say that that's possession just for use, right, of himself, and then somebody else could say, no, that's in possession with intent, and that would be up to like some combination of like the police officer, like the arresting officer, the attorneys involved,
Sure.
right? Like it's very like it's very subjective,
yeah,
as opposed to like written into law. This is how much it is.
My next door neighbor, my freshman year, was in a friend's car and they got pulled over, and he had marijuana on him in a little baggie in his pocket, and it was enough for him. But because it was in a baggie, they said, "This is evidence that you intend to distribute this." And he was like, "No, I just don't keep loose weed in my pocket, like." And so it enhanced his charge.
Yeah.
And even then, I mean, I was 18 and didn't know anything, and I was like, that doesn't seem fair, right? Like, how do?
Well, and if you have not walked a mile in those shoes, then you don't think about those things. So when I was presented with this bill, it was actually one that I took over mid-session, but so I had to kind of get read up on it really quick, and there's still obviously more to learn. But if you have not walked a mile in those shoes, you're learning everything from scratch. I mean, I just didn't know what all was involved with that. So it's a measuring device, baggies, the actual drug or substance itself, and then several other factors. So when we talked about what they were trying to do was just get a more clear definition in statute of what that looked like. It seems pretty simple. And we were talking about that too before. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't.
And it matters, right? Because the difference in punishment, right, is significant, right? Like the difference in having weed on you because you're going to smoke it, and then having weed on you because you're going to sell it to people, or cocaine, or whatever the case may be. Like that's a marked difference in terms of how much time you might spend behind bars, etc.
Well, yes, and I understand that. I think most people can understand that, right? I'm doing harm to myself where I intend to do harm to others. So, I think most people would understand that point is not lost on them. But we understand in this day and age, it's just not simple. So you need that clear definition.
Right. Totally. I mean, because my point would be, if we're looking at if it's a sentence of 2 years versus a sentence of 10 years, I mean, we should be really clear about what causes you to get a sentence of 10 years. Like there shouldn't be that like subjectivity of like, well, maybe it's this much or maybe it's this much.
Especially if we've identified in this state that we're leading in a metric that we probably shouldn't lead in.
Right. Sure.
I didn't go into this session really with much of an agenda other than I wanted to try and help and do some good. But being a new legislator, I wanted to observe and pay attention and figure out what my lane was. I heard that as a piece of advice from a number of different people. But criminal justice reform was something that sparked my interest and caught my eye from a couple of perspectives. One, just the way in which I was raised and I believe now and try and live my life. It's an opportunity for us to reunite families if we can get it right, right, and offer these individuals a second chance, a hand up, not a handout, but get them the help that they need from a mental health standpoint or substance abuse standpoint. But from a fiscal standpoint, and what I've done in the private sector, when we look at someone's individual financial plan, we're looking at money coming in and money going out. Oftentimes, if it were just an issue of the money that they had to create income for when they're voluntarily unemployed, they didn't have any expenses, money, then money going out, then we could create a retirement plan for you. But a lot of times you stub your toe on the fact that you have expenses that exceed the income you can generate. Well, we can only do so many things to create revenue without taxing, which nobody likes that, right? Well, I need to take a look at my expenses as well. And so it's a matter of, am I willing to do this together with people that don't look like me, that maybe haven't lived like me, that come from different experience and background? Am I willing to make some concession and see if we can figure that out?
Right. So as I think this last year, once these laws were passed and they're being implemented, as Scott alluded to earlier, there's just the realization that, hey, like this stuff has changed from how it was 3, 4, 5 years ago, right? That there are now people that are in prison because they were sent there for a crime that is either no longer a crime or the punishment for that crime has decreased dramatically. And as we look at our state being the top incarcerating entity like in the world, right? So how do we, and our DOC facilities being
in terrible shape.
Yeah, just, overextended in every way. It's like, well,
Every
here's
way.
a way to relieve some of that pressure on DOC, but it's not as simple as just like going down the roster and just letting folks out. Like there may be some of that, but there's a lot of enhancements and things that complicate and muddy the waters. So what did you see this year, or where are we in this effort to make things like retroactive?
I think, well, this is what I saw. This was my experience. So we were talking about how new the legislature is.
Right.
I think 85% has 4 years or less. So there's some institutional knowledge that is just not there.
Right.
Not that it won't come back.
Yeah.
But it's just different. So an understanding of who all's involved in the process, what that looks like. So in my research I talked to DAs, ADAs, I talked to attorneys, I talked to a couple of judges, because I wanted to have an understanding not just from one side. I needed to understand both. And I mean, you could spend a ton of time, 2, 3, 4 sessions. I mean, we've been working on criminal justice reform as a state for several years and making strides. But these 2 bills that I mentioned, they were priority bills. But even if we would have, as a legislature, passed all of the priority bills that the groups brought forward, it wouldn't have changed. I think it would have just stopped growth. So we would have flatlined. Right. We wouldn't have decreased. So there's still a lot of work to do. We've seen other states make strides before us. I think it's important. I think you can learn from that, right? What did they get right? What did they get wrong? But it's, again, I think you have to understand who all's involved, how they're involved. What are the unintended consequences? Am I making somebody's job harder? Mm-hmm. Are we getting it right? So are we allowing, because like you said, you can't just go through the list and say, okay, you get out and you get out and you get out.
Right.
Are we getting it right?
Right.
And does it affect change?
Sure. So maybe looking ahead to the 2020 session, undoubtedly criminal justice reform will be another topic, especially it's election year. So there's vested interest on probably both sides to talk about it. And as you said, a lot of work that's yet to be done.
Yeah.
What do you think will be the direction that the legislature takes, and specifically anything that you were looking at?
Well, I think it depends on what happens here over the next few months. So we just filed for interim studies. Mm-hmm. I think the Senate's deadline was today, if I'm not mistaken. So those will get sorted through, and we'll see what comes out of that. I know the governor put together another criminal justice reform task force. Mm-hmm. There's the classification or reclassification council. So there's a number of pieces that are moving, and like you said, it is something that everybody's talking about. Right. Traditionally speaking, that wouldn't be really or get a whole lot of play on the Republican side.
Sure.
Some, but over the last few years, it's continued to gain in popularity. You're hearing it not only at a state level, but on a national level, that people are talking about criminal justice reform. And of course, you see the stories. You always see these stories, the feel-good stories of somebody that is getting out and doing good in society and mm-hmm. being reunited with your family. I think we can do that a lot. I think there are many opportunities for us to do that.
Yeah.
But I think I believe it important also that when we're talking about this criminal justice reform and reuniting families and relieving pressure points on our corrections facilities, am I really helping people so that they have an opportunity to reintegrate back into society? So providing housing, jobs, an opportunity for them to success, because a big part of that, especially if it's addiction, is I'm not going right back into the same situation that I left or landed me in this situation. And then you've got the whole debtor's prison issue and bail and you know, all of that. I mean, there's a number of different plates that are spinning there that if you can do it right and you get everybody in the room, or some legislators that really understand how it all works together, or they work together well enough.
Yeah, I think
you can do it holistically.
I think, yeah, I agree. I think one of the things, and this is something that, you know, we were talking about beforehand that you definitely kind of ran into this year. It sounds like, you know, you had two bills, priority bills, worked on them, right? They got through the House, they got through the Senate. There were some changes made, you know. Ultimately, neither of those ended up getting signed into law, right?
They did not. They're live rounds, ready to go
for next, because you know for those playing the home game. Just a reminder, this is still the 57th legislature, so we've had one session. Right. We'll have the next session of the 57th legislature. So bills that were, you know, that didn't make it through this time, depending on some kind of nuances of the rules of the legislature, they can come back. And be heard again and kind of go through the whole process this next time around starting in February. But what do you think? I mean, because you're right. You know, like people on the left are talking about it. People on the right are talking about it. Criminal justice reform is a big issue right now. But here we have two bills that kind of went through the whole process that are good bills that couldn't get there. Sometimes it seems like everybody's on board. I mean, hell, the 780 retroactivity that almost happened with 780 retroactivity, right? Like,
yeah,
everything was looking good, and then it was like the last week of the legislature, and it was on the calendar, and then it wasn't, and then the Senate goes to recess, and then there's a caucus, and they come back, and there's a vote, and there's no debate, and they pass it, and it's done. And it's like, holy shit, what the hell happened, right? Politics, there was right, like there was some stuff going on behind the scenes. Yeah. But sometimes it seems like even when everybody's on the same page, everybody wants it to get done, and you get everybody in the room, like there's reasons that it still doesn't happen. So I guess where I'm kind of leading with all of this is, number one, just as a freshman, was it surprising to you to see some things play out like that, right? Like to see bills that you've worked on and that you know have broad support not quite get over the finish line? And do you think that the political will to move forward on some of these things maybe is going to be there in the next session of the 57th?
I believe so. I believe it is. And I alluded to the newness of the legislature, and you know that we have that same newness in the governor's office. Good governor, I think, doing a good job. Popular, made some good calls and some tough calls. You know, history is always the judge of good and bad.
I'll say bad. You don't have to say bad.
Yeah.
I'll say bad. He made some good calls and he's made some bad calls.
like we all do.
Right.
Yeah.
Everybody does. Sure.
Same thing.
But I believe so. I think that, but you have to find your voice, right? So one of the things that I saw, and if you look at the bills and you look at the percentage of which of them are amendments to existing statute and which ones are new, you know, huge percentage of them are amendments.
Yeah.
And it's taking care of unintended consequences one way or the other.
Sure.
So when you're talking about a subject like this, maybe it's a little heavier.
Sure.
There's more on the line. So
sure.
But there's more on the line both ways, right? If I get it right or wrong.
Yeah.
You know, I'm either reuniting somebody's family and changing that family's life forever because, you know, somebody's back in the home that hadn't been there, learned from their mistake, or I'm letting somebody out that, you know, doesn't need to be out.
Right.
So I think it's important for those that are listening to understand that when these sections of incarcerated folks are being evaluated, it's with public safety in mind. You know, we're not looking at violent offenders. Now there's still work to do there.
Sure.
With the classifications of some things in Oklahoma, which that was kind of a surprise to me, but violent and nonviolent.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little more about that?
I'll speak generally about it, but domestic abuse and strangulation, nonviolent in the state of Oklahoma.
Even though it's clearly violent. And,
I can't think of any more violent than to look you in the eye while I'm strangling you.
Right, yeah.
That seems pretty violent.
I'll be honest, so I didn't know that. I did not know that domestic violence and strangulation are considered non-violent offenses. It is astonishing to me. I mean,
I don't want to say domestic violence as a whole.
Okay.
I was just in the realm of domestic violence. So
So two things. One, as a note about this in the legislature, is that former Representative Scott Biggs, right, who is, I mean, in many ways, like, I would say the champion of criminal justice bills, not reform bills necessarily, but he was a former DA and was a very law and order guy. The reason that he opposed so many, from what I've been told by former legislators, is that the reason that Biggs opposed so many reform bills is because of things like this. He was like, listen, we can't do it because this is classified incorrectly. And if we say all nonviolent things, that means
you're going to let some violent people out of prison.
Right. And I was like, but I was like, well, why not change that one issue? And that issue, like strangulation, is in like 80 something different statutes. And so it's like, and we have a single subject rule. And so it's like 80 bills would have to be dedicated to change it everywhere. And that's a very tedious process. Right?
Yeah, it is. So I didn't know that either, though. When you get into it, and then somebody, so you think you're going to move forward, right? Mm-hmm. Then somebody comes at the last minute on the way to the floor, on the way to committee, and they say, "Hey, I don't know if you knew this, but strangulation
you picked a hell of a time to tell me."
Right. So
this would have been super helpful a week ago.
Yeah.
And that's
a tactic sometimes.
Sure,
that's true.
But.
And this is not a fun fact, but a fact is that, I'll say it this way, if a man puts his hands on a woman's throat even once, like whether it's just on her throat or like actually trying to choke her, that woman has like, I'll get the number wrong, it's like a tenfold increase in the chance that she will die.
That he will come back and actually murder her at some point in her life. Yeah, I heard that too.
There's some folks that are dealing with like domestic violence stuff, and the rates in Oklahoma are super high, particularly female deaths from that. And when I listened to, I think Scott Mitchell had a podcast about it, and they were talking about it, and I was just floored.
Yeah,
it's through the roof, and it's scary. So to go back to that point, I mean, I think it's you got to know that, and because you don't want that unintended consequence on your hands. Nobody does. And I don't say that like I mean that's in all seriousness. So that's the depth and breadth of what you're doing there.
I do want to come back and say and this is not even like a chat to something you said, Andy, about Representative Biggs, and like that he's a very like law and order guy, and I obviously know what you mean by that. Mm-hmm. But I think one thing that's important to just like say and put out there is that I think though that even people that are very kind of on the opposite side politically, right, or even opposite side of policy of where Representative Biggs was when he was in the legislature, I think they would say that they're law and order people too.
Oh, right.
Right? Like nobody is wanting to just like let people do whatever they want, right? It's just a question of like, one, what should be a crime, what shouldn't be a crime, and two, if you commit a crime, what is the like? I think that to me, and we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, like a lot of this is getting at what is the fundamental purpose of the criminal justice system, right? Is it to punish?
That's a good question.
Is it to punish the offender? Mm-hmm. Is it to protect society? Mm-hmm. Is it to protect the offender in some cases? Like, is it a combination of all three? Yeah. Like one thing that's really instructive to me, I think about this a lot, is the word penitentiary, right? So anybody know where the first penitentiary was built in the United States?
No, but I believe you're going to tell us.
Yeah. So it was in Pennsylvania, and it was the first time that they'd ever used the word penitentiary. And it's now, I forget the name of it because it was closed in like 1978 as a like absolutely notorious prison that was holding 5 or 6 times what it was built for. But at the time that it was built, it was a state-of-the-art facility that had like very like big, spacious, well-lit rooms for inmates. It had kitchen facilities. It had classrooms. It had high walls around it, but they called it a penitentiary because the word, like the root word, was penitence, right? Like it was supposed to be a place of like learning and reflection and reform and betterment, so that when you kind of were released, and that's why they did away with the term prisoner into the term inmate, right? Was so that when people left, they would be in a better place than they were before.
Whoops.
Right? Right. And that's not,
we
and
don't
that's
have
not,
that.
right. And that's like, and yet we think about, like, does anybody think that happens at the state penitentiary McAllister? Right? Like, you know,
Negative.
and so for me, that's something that I feel like is, you know, is important that all of us, as we're talking about these things, like keep in mind, like what problem are we trying to solve?
It's a good question, and it goes back to something I think that I referred to. You know, am I willing to walk a mile in someone else's shoes while I'm going through this process to see about getting it right, giving them another chance.
Right.
You know,
earlier we were talking about retroactivity and what happens if we let folks out of prison, right? And we can't just have a big list and let everybody out, because
I don't even know if they have that list.
Well,
honestly.
they probably don't.
That's part we've alluded to that with the Department of Corrections, but the underfunding there, and the, you know, lack of the state of the jails. I mean, some of them are. Well,
we'd lost that. There's someone that's been saying in Oklahoma County that she hadn't gone to court. No one had called or checked on her for like 8 months. Yeah, just hanging out. I mean, not hanging out, like losing life, right? Like just slipping by.
Yeah.
So there's kind of two things, and we didn't say this explicitly, but as we've been talking, we said there needs to be a mechanism, a review, a process by which this retroactivity is implemented, so that people are released and discharged from prison, and whatever happens with their records, like expungement or whatever needs to happen, happens in a thoughtful manner for a couple of reasons. One, to make sure that we don't unintentionally release folks that society or that the system deems that they need to be in there, right? So violent criminals or people whose crimes were legitimately the reason they're there. We need to make a plan for when they get out, of where they're going to live and how they're going to get reintegrated in society. And back in the 60s, 70s, when the model in the United States shifted away from these mental health institutions, right? We had a bunch of asylums that we would lock people up with mental health issues. And it came to a big breaking point, right? Where they shifted away from that to the community model. But in many places, Oklahoma in particular, I will use the term intentionally, like a bit of a dumping ground for folks with mental health issues. People would ship them here and house them in asylums. And then this happened abruptly, where they literally opened the doors and just kind of said, go out, go get a job, go find a place to live. And not everyone made the jump to like an actual community-based treatment facility. And so a lot of folks ended up on the streets, right? Yeah. And so that is one of the reasons that Oklahoma has such a high incidence of mental illness, particularly in our homeless populations, is that it's this carryover from what happened 40, 50 years ago. And we don't want to make the same kind of mistake now, right? Like we know that now if someone is released from prison, they are unlikely to like make that call when they get home of like, I need to call and set up my doctor's appointment and that kind of thing. And so we've got to have some foresight and at least make an effort to make sure that they get the right connections.
Well, would they make the call if they had health insurance, if they had access to care? Right. I mean, all of this, right? Because we're going to be talking about Medicaid expansion this next session.
Well, and I think there's things that are even. I mean, that's a fundamental, right? Like that's fundamental. Like, would they make the call if they had health insurance? But like, let's just say somebody who's been in prison for, let's say they've been 10 years, right? So it's 2009. So they were incarcerated in 2019. They get out, or 2009 they get out, right? Like, the way you access information, like how you contact your doctor, has changed fundamentally in the last 10 years. Right. And 2009 had changed fundamentally in the 10 years before that, right? Like, I mean, nobody was using phone books 10 years ago, right? But even the internet is different. It's a different place than it was 10 years ago, right? Like apps didn't exist 10 years ago, right? Like you couldn't send a message to your primary care doctor through the healthcare app on your smartphone. Right. Like that wasn't a thing. I think especially in today's world, as fast as technology changes, like how we do things, right? Like we talk about Twitter and Snapchat and Facebook like they're just part of life, but none of those things existed. I'm dating myself, but like, and you too.
Yeah, no,
like
no, you're
none,
right.
none of those things existed when I was in college.
Oh yeah.
Right? Like smartphones weren't a thing until I'd been out of college for 2 years. So for someone who's been incarcerated for 10 or 15 years,
You've
like,
missed out on.
well, they don't have like, they're missing a like fundamental skill set.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you were incarcerated in 1980 and you got out in 1995, there was a whole bunch that changed, but you still looked up a phone number in a phone book.
Right.
Right? Like you still had a quarter still worked in a payphone. We've kind of undergone this like fundamental shift in how you access and use information. And if you've been in prison for really even part of that, you've missed a lot.
So to give a real life example from here in Oklahoma to illustrate your point. So I work with, as our listeners probably know, like work with people with HIV and AIDS.
Okay.
And as they cycle in and out of the criminal justice system, our grant program, our federal programs can help them if they're at the county level because they're still personally responsible for the cost of medications. And once they move into DOC custody, DOC is responsible for all their health care, right? Mm-hmm. And we do telemedicine, so we can like keep them in care. They can get their medications and all that, which is the key to surviving. And then once they're discharged, they used to get a few months of medications. Now they might get 30 days, usually 2 weeks of meds, and then like a phone number. If we're lucky, we know their discharge date and they've got an appointment with us, but more often than not, that's not the case. So they'll be discharged from prison in some other city, right? Like they will get out in Granite and then have to find a way to get to Oklahoma City with their relative or friend. And even if they have an appointment, they don't necessarily know where the clinic is or how they're going to get there. They don't have a car. They can't call us. They don't have a phone. There's not pay phones to like go find to call and say, I can't make an appointment. So they miss that appointment. There's a no-show. They don't have medications. And so we have this big gap where folks get out of prison and then get off their meds, and they may feel fine, but the virus starts taking hold and they start getting sicker. And it's like I've been doing this for 10 years. Tomorrow is my 10-year work anniversary. And I met the guy at DOC that handles this when I first started, like the first week. And 10 years later, he's still there. I'm here. And it's arguably gotten worse because we lost some grants that helped with this. And so people then get out and don't have the resources to connect for healthcare that they need. And this is a public health issue. You're on the public health committee, aren't you?
I am on the public health committee.
You know, their viral load goes up, they become more infectious, and whoop, this is how we get more infections. And so,
well, and if they go back into the system and they're incarcerated again, then they're more costly. So it's roughly it's just over $20,000 a year to keep someone incarcerated. That's for a healthy individual. Right. I've seen numbers as high as $60,000 on an annual basis for someone with hepatitis.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really costly.
Yeah.
So I think it's important. I think it's imperative that we get this right, that we're focused on it, that it's a priority, the reintegration back into society. I mean, we've talked about a couple of those. We actually passed a bill. It was a bill that I ran for. It was a request bill from City Care. And what it did was it allowed for a landlord of a facility, a residence that had been purchased with the affordable housing tax credit,
right,
for them to be able to rent or lease to someone with a prior felony conviction.
Oh, right. Because even that association would hurt the person that had the place. Yeah.
Right. So if you talk about we've identified folks, now we're going to let them out, and release them back into society. Maslow's hierarchy of needs starts over. You know, I got to have food, water, and shelter.
That's one of those things. Like, I have friends and some family that have had past felony convictions, and they are good people, and I wouldn't think twice about letting them stay with me. But if I received a portion of my housing like through this program, I couldn't do that because I would jeopardize my own housing. Right. And we end up like perpetuating this problem in families and keeping folks down.
And I think a lot of people don't know that. I mean, they don't realize that it's set up that way. And again, I think sometimes it's unintended consequences, but do we have a group of people willing to look at it, address it, fix it, make it better?
Right.
As we're looking ahead towards the second session of the 57th here in 2020, what are your top three? You look at the landscape of the criminal justice system in Oklahoma, and if there's three things that we can get done next year out of the legislature, let's say, to improve where we're at, what are those three things? The three kind of biggest impact, most important things.
I think, well, it would be criminal justice reform. I think that we can make a huge impact because I talked about that from my private sector experience. I think that's a money out area that we can do better. I would like to see us, and I believe that we will, get in front of Medicaid expansion. So put something forward to stave off the initiative petition. Not that I think it's bad. I don't even know what they're proposing. But learn from 788, right? So we didn't get in front of that, and you got recreational marijuana disguised as medical marijuana. So I'd like to see that. I think that's important. And the third one, I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
Is there a particular aspect of criminal justice reform that you think would be most important to kind of make the priority?
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, because those two bills were priority bills, but they were very different in nature.
Sure.
So no, not necessarily, because we've talked about several different aspects, and I think that I think you can address it, either one of those, and that represents about 5,000 beds, I think.
Yeah.
Over a 10-year period.
Sure.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's half $1 billion.
Yeah. So, one question we ask most of our guests is, we're big on citizen engagement, right? And so, from your perspective, why is it important for the people of Oklahoma to care about these issues, and what ways do you see that they can and should get involved?
Oh, great question. Glad you asked that. The third one, I've said this before. I was drawing a blank there. I was trying really hard to come up with that, and it just wasn't coming. Obviously, oil and gas is a big piece of our economy.
Sure.
Huge piece.
Sure.
And as long as we have that resource, it will be. But I would like to see us continue to encourage other industry to the state. Right. So I think we've done some of that.
Yeah.
I really love to see what the lieutenant governor is doing and in his branding of Oklahoma, and going out and being the face of Oklahoma and saying, hey, look, it's a great place to be. Come here.
Yeah.
So that was number 3. Sorry. And you're going to have to repeat that question.
That's okay, no problem. So, one of the things that we really care about is citizen engagement and helping people get involved. So, from your perspective, what do you think, why is it important for folks to be engaged in the discussion of criminal justice reform, and how do you recommend people get involved?
Well, I think it's important because of some of the reasons that we've talked about, in the idea of reuniting families, getting other people's perspective, being willing to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. I think that creates community. When you have community, you can do a lot of good. How do you get engaged? There's a number of different ways. I would go and check out Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform website. The interim studies, follow those on the legislature's website, so they should be posting those, which ones got approved and the schedules, and come sit in on those.
Yeah.
You can do that.
Yeah, people. So this is a good reminder that as we move towards the fall and these the later part of the summer and into the fall, that as these interim studies occur, They are usually streamed on the legislature's website, oklegislature.gov, and depending on which chamber, it'll be on that chamber's site. But you can also go visit. You can sit in.
You can go and be a part of the meeting, so you can listen to it live. But I was asked earlier today with the first podcast that I did for the day. The lady that was asking the questions, we talked a little bit about criminal justice reform, and she said, hey, I would like to be involved.
Yeah.
And I said, I'll email you when we get the schedule, and come see us.
Right on.
Yeah.
Excellent. Representative Mize, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure.
We appreciate your time.
Thanks again to Representative Mize for his time and our previous guests in the series, Damian Shade, Ryan Gensler, and Brian Jones. Thanks to my ride or die co-host, Scott Melson, and most importantly, thanks to you, our listeners, for supporting our podcast, our parent organization, Let's Fix This, and, well, just for being the kind of people who care about making our state better and are willing to put your time and your money into making it happen. On that note, if you'd like to support our podcast, please consider making a donation to Let's Fix This at letsfixthisok.org/donate. If you'd rather get something in exchange, besides just a warm, fuzzy heart, you can get some Let's Fix This merch. Go to letsfixthisok.org/store. As a reminder, next week we'll start our series on gerrymandering and redistricting, which is almost certain to be eye-opening for everybody. Also, mark your calendars for Monday, August 19th, which will be our next The West Wing watch party at the Tower Theater in Oklahoma City. We'll be watching the episode entitled The Supremes, and we're going to have a panel discussion right afterwards with Oklahoma's Solicitor General Mithin Maganzani and Assistant Solicitor General Zach West. They're going to be sharing their experiences working with both the Supreme Court here in our state as well as the Supreme Court of the United States, or SCOTUS, if you're a political nerd. Let's Pod This is a production of Let's Fix This and is edited and produced by Scott Melson and me. Our theme music is provided by the Sugar Free All-Stars. We want all Oklahomans to be active and engaged with their government because, well, that's how we fix this. Have a great week.